So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the ground-hornbills. Much better than pangolins to start with. Just to start with. I'm going to tell you a bit about the ground-hornbills and the whole Lowveld expansion project that we have going and that we have planned for the species. So just to begin with, obviously a few basics about the species that is a big factor when considering the whole conservation concept around the species. Firstly, I hope all of you here have seen ground-hornbills before. Has anyone not seen a ground-hornbill before? One person. Okay, well that's a ground-hornbill on the screen. Yeah, so they are these really big, large birds, but they're actually cooperative breeders. So cooperative breeding means that they're group living, and the whole group will contribute to the raising of a single offspring. So with ground-hornbills, they'll try and lay, or never, but then the whole group will contribute to the raising of a single chick with ground-hornbills. But with each of these groups, there's generally only a single adult female within the groups, followed by several male helpers. So the female is the boss, and the male helpers are her servants, pretty much. She's done something right. But they occupy these extremely large territories. My computer's out, John. They occupy these extremely large territories of about 100 square kilometers. In this area, in the Lowveld here, it's about 80 square kilometers, so extremely large territories. They're also extremely long-lived. They live for about 50 to 60 years in the wild. So for us conservationists in Hoedspruit and around this area, we've had research and conservation that's been going on for 23 odd years now, and we've actually pretty much just gone past generation 1. So it's they're extremely long-lived, which makes things extremely difficult for the species, because obviously everything that they do takes time. They also have this very low productivity. So at maximum they can reproduce or produce one chick per year. This is obviously not the case because they're so long-lived. What they do is, unlike a lot of short-lived species who generally try and maximize their current breeding events, so they'll try and breed every year before they die, because ground-hornbills and other long-lived species live so long, they'll try and maximize their lifetime reproductive success. So rather than breeding every year, they'll try and wait for conditions to be ideal and then breed. And this means, like I said, it's very slow. They also have very high site fidelity, so this just means they generally stay within certain areas. So these are all just concepts and factors of the species that really contribute to our decisions when we're trying to conserve them. So I need it. Charles chase me this side.
No, you can stand outside.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you. So when we look at the actual whole population in South Africa, this is kind of generally what you see. The blue squares here, for those of you who don't know, this is South Africa. The blue squares are the historic range that the species has. The yellow squares are the current range that we're aware of at least. So you can see this range reduction by up to 70% in the past 100 years. They've been struggling. Obviously up in this northeastern part, this is Kruger National Park, and around the Hoedspruit area, they're doing pretty well. So that's why we're trying to just help them do even better. So when it comes to threats, there's a lot of things, but like most species that are under threat, the issue is always humans. We all know this, human expansion puts a lot of pressure on the environment, puts a lot of pressure on species. With ground-hornbills, it's often a loss of natural nesting sites and a loss of foraging grounds. So ground-hornbills nest in big tree cavities, so usually at least 4 meters off the ground. The cavity needs to be at least 40 centimeters wide. So you're thinking now 4 meters off the ground, a cavity 40 centimeters wide, that's a big cavity. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot left of them because people cutting down trees, all of us here that live in the bush and have been in the bush, you drive around this bush where it's really shrubby, you see a big tree, what are you going to do? There's going to be a road going smack bang under the tree. And while it's great to appreciate nature that way, it often means that ground-hornbills are disturbed when they're trying to breed. So another threat is persecution for window breakages. I'm sure all of us have seen, the smaller birds at this point, at this time of year. We've got a lot of barbets, even the The hornbills are sometimes, the smaller hornbills pecking on their windows. Same for ground hornbills, except they're much bigger, a lot more powerful, and they break the windows, and people just get sick and tired of them and end up killing them. So I actually heard, a couple of weeks ago, I heard about an incident that occurred, I don't remember, with northern Limpopo or Zimbabwe, 200 windows in one day that the birds broke. So you can imagine, for affluent areas that might, 200 windows is a lot, but for affluent areas it might not be a big issue. But when you're in poorer communities and things like that, breaking a lot of windows consistently can become a big issue. Then secondary poisoning. One of the big issues is lead. I'm not going to go into too much detail because there's a few lead experts in the room, I think. But essentially it's from the consumption of lead, and ground hornbills are really susceptible, so they die if they consume any lead. So what lead does is that it mimics other metals. Even you probably know this better than me. It'll mimic other metals, so it binds to molecules, but unlike the other metals, it doesn't break down, but it just accumulates. So if a ground hornbill, it takes one little fragment, and the ground hornbill is pretty much dead. It's also unfortunate they get affected because they're non-target species, so there's a big issue with poisoning of vultures and lions and all these things. But what happens is because ground hornbills sometimes scavenge, is that they'll go and scavenge off these carcasses, which means they also die. Electrocution on transformer boxes is also an issue. As I mentioned, they like to break things with the windows. They do just generally like to bang on anything that'll make a noise. Unfortunately, transformer boxes are one of these things, so when they peck and then they just get electrocuted. And then I've added trade in here, but trade is, at the moment, it's not a big factor. For ground hornbills, it's a small factor at the moment. Up in Nigeria, the other hornbills, the cased hornbills, there is a little bit of an increase in the trade, but for ground hornbills at this moment is not a huge issue, thankfully. But that's, we're keeping an eye on that always. So I work for Mabula Ground-Hornbill Project. We are the only conservation project dedicated solely to the conservation of ground hornbills, and we've got a whole bunch of different aspects that we focus our project on. Firstly, monitoring the birds. So in order to conserve them, you need to know where they are, where they're struggling, things like that. Research, because all conservation has a very strong research and scientifically based approach. We also have mitigation, so this is just tackling all these threats that I mentioned to you. Then restore. So restoring is a whole project that we do, and it's based around the reintroduction of birds. So I'll go a little bit more into that just now, but it's just reintroducing birds back into their historic range. Community work. This is a big part of what we do. We can't conserve anything if you're not involved in communities. Communities are a huge factor that is incredibly important in order to conserve our environment. So we work with them, we have education programs, we try and create custodians so that people take pride in the nature that they're surrounded by, and just get everyone on board. And then improve, and that's kind of just our project trying to develop the staff that we have, rather, so that we can build capacity, not just for ground hornbill conservation, but for conservation in general. So as I mentioned, we have these mitigation things, and in the Lowveld, one of the big factors here is artificial nests. You can see, I'm sure some of you have heard about artificial nests in and around Hoedspruit here, but they are a huge help for the species. Like I mentioned, there's a shortage of them, so we actually go and we'll install these artificial nests and pretty much just wait for the birds to come. And what it does is that because ground hornbills have these extremely large territories, but they're also extremely large and long-lived, natural dispersal of the birds takes long, but when they find a nest, they tend to anchor to those points. So by us putting up nests in areas where they don't frequently occur, if by chance a dispersing bird comes through and they find the nest, they either anchor to it and hang around the nest, or they kind of just remember where it is and will frequently return, or more frequently return to investigate and look for mates. When it comes to these nests though, there's a lot of aspects to consider, and we're trialing a whole bunch of different materials. Like I've said this a few times now, ground-hornbills like to break stuff, and this includes their nest sites. It's very counterproductive and a pain in the ass really, but if I'm honest. But so we're trying to test out all these materials because we want it to be really, really strong. We don't want to have to go and put nests up every 3 years. We want to put a nest up and have it up there for the next 20, 30 years. But the other aspect of that is that even though it's hard, we can't have it just becoming a little hot box. It needs to be well ventilated and actually be made of a material that allows for the chicks to grow, because actually when conditions are hotter, chicks decrease in weight, so it actually has an effect on their body condition. So we're testing out constantly these new designs for our nests and constantly developing how to improve. So the other side, as I mentioned, we have a reintroduction program. So what ground-hornbills do, not every year, I think on average ground-hornbills in this area lay every 3 years, but ground-hornbills lay 2 eggs, and these eggs are laid about 5 days apart from each other. They're laid 5 days apart, and they hatch about 5 days apart. And what that results in, let's see if this works. It's a no. So what happens is that you get this. It's not great, but what happens is that you get this really big size difference between the first hatch chick and the second hatch chick. So this black, beautiful looking thing here is the first hatch chick, and this is the second hatch chick. So this, you can see the size difference, and all that happens is that this bigger one simply just outcompetes the smaller one. The smaller one gets so hungry that it starts eating leaves, and what happens is that the stomach just gets compacted with leaves, and it dies. It dies invariably in the wild. We've even tried supplementary feeding the birds to get to them to raise 2, but it always dies. And when it dies, the female, the mother, eats it. Delicious, yeah. So before this chick dies, we'll go in and we'll actually take this chick out of the nest. So we wait for it to hatch, and as soon as it hatches, within the first 3 days, we'll go into the nest and we'll take this chick and we send it to Loscorp Dam, where we've got a specialized ground-hornbill rearing facility where they will be put with, well, they'll be reared until about fledging age, and then they get released into aviaries with semi-wild birds. So they get released with minimal human impact, and then they can learn, that's fine. Then they can learn how to do ground-hornbill things from ground-hornbills, pretty much. And then after a few years, as I mentioned, they're extremely long-lived. They take very long to mature. So generally it takes them about 6 to 8 years to reach sexual maturity. So really long, and our studies have shown that you can't just take a chick and release them straight into the wild. They're actually really stupid when they leave the nest. They can't fly. They don't know how to feed. I don't know if any of you have ever watched a newly fledged chick trying to feed on its own, but it's hilarious. They just absolutely don't know how to do it. So they've got to learn how to do these things. They've got to learn how to catch snakes. They need to learn how to look for certain prey species, etc., etc. So we have to keep them in these aviaries for several years before we can then actually reform groups and then release them back into the wild. Okay, John. Yeah.
Yay!
Thank you. So I'll just carry on talking about that. So yeah, so what we do is we'll actually, when we're trying to reform these groups, they have their own personalities pretty much. So what we'll do is we actually have to test out which birds interact well with other birds. It's not just the case of put birds in the aviary, release them kind of thing. We have to test, this one likes this one likes this one, etc., etc. So it's a bit of a slow process, but but we get there eventually. So we've already done this reintroduction. It's happened several times, and it's been really successful to the point now where we actually have released birds or reintroduced birds breeding on their own. Are there any questions so far, since we have a little intermission? And I've been talking for 4 hours already. So. Yes?
How do you tell the male and the female apart?
So the male's a good question, and I probably should have covered when I was talking about biology. The females have a blue patch under the throat, whereas the males have a solid red patch under the throat. Juveniles they've got like a pale coloured throat, blue eyes, they've got brown feathers, short bills, and then they go through like a subadult stage, which is very patchy, so it'll be like yellow and red and not solid coloration, pretty much. Yeah. Yes.
What's the point of having two chicks if the one never spawns? I mean, nature knows what she's doing, so everyone knows.
So for those of you who didn't hear, the question is, what's the point of laying 2 chicks if only one survives? And it's best guess pretty much, but it's insurance. So the first chick does not always survive, eggs fail, etc., etc. And that's the exact reason why we don't take the second egg, we take the second chick. So if the first egg fails or the chick dies in the first few days, then the second one can survive. Yeah. Pardon? Yes, you know. Yeah. So we take the chick, and then the chick actually goes into, we've got a little incubator that we carry with us, and then I don't know if you remember what temperature the chick needs to be at. It's quite warm, and it's like, yeah, 38 degrees. Yeah, no, it's warm, it's very, very warm inside there, yeah. Okay, question at the back there. Outside of Kruger. At the moment, the APNR is probably the stronghold. I would say APNR, which, those of you who don't know where the APNR is, it's the collection of privately owned reserves, Siri, Timavati, Lowveld, Thorny Bush and Baluli. That's probably the biggest stronghold of the population we have. Obviously Kruger. Protected areas usually do well. Parts of KZN, but in South Africa, that's probably it. And then you can go into parts of Zimbabwe and places like that. But yeah, this area is one of the big strongholds for the species, and that's why we're trying to focus on the expansion out of these areas. Yes?
Why did you first start? Why do you like?
Why do I like ground-hornbills?
Yeah.
Why don't you like No, they're very charismatic birds. Carrie and myself started working on these birds actually by sheer chance. We heard that previous researchers were leaving, and Carrie and I we were looking for something to do, drove to their door, asked them what was happening. Nothing was happening, so we said, well, we'd love to take it over. And that was 7 years and a PhD ago. So, yeah.
I guess so.
Thank you. Do I bow? So that's something more along the lines, I tried...
Sorry. Just quickly.
Can you repeat the question? Yeah, I'll do that. Thanks, I'll remember to do that more frequently.
No.
But this is not working. Okay, so the question is, what conditions do they wait for? Because I mentioned that they wait for favorable conditions to breed. It's not an easy thing to answer. Especially for ground-hornbills, because you could say, if it's really dry, they're not going to breed. But ground-hornbills don't drink water; they get all their moisture from food. Rainfall probably is a big factor to consider, but it's not something I can say definitely. I mean, obviously, extreme drought will be a factor. Even the opposite, extreme rainfall, will be a big factor. Temperature, so that's something that Carrie is looking into now, the actual direct effects of temperature and indirect effects of temperature, not only on the chicks but also on adults. And interestingly, what she's found, yay, getting that in this? No. Halfway there. Interestingly, what Carrie's found is that, for those of you who don't know, surprise, climate change, temperatures in this area are increasing, and actually Carrie's been looking at all the climate data for Hoedspruit and Skukuza over the last 60 years, and winter temperatures are getting hotter at a faster rate than summer temperatures. So pretty much winters are getting hotter, and because it's really dry in this area, it also means that ground hornbills are experiencing heat stress and heat strain in winter and not only summer. So if you spend a lot of time in the sun in winter, you can also get pretty hot, and that can actually affect the bird's body condition, which then affects their decision on whether or not to breed. Okay, good to know. Yes. How do we track their movement? That's a perfect question, because I'm going to talk about that now. Yeah, that's perfect.
What's on your next slide?
Yeah, and John ruined it all. Yeah, definitely ruined it. It has to restart now. Sorry. One job, eh? Yeah, one job. Yes.
How do you hand raise the little chicks without much?
So it's very much, it's got a lot to do with the facility that we have. It's pretty much hand raising them until fledging. So it's about 70, 80 days, it's very much by hand, but also they're in a room and you only go in when you need to feed them. Once they reach that fledging age, they get put into these aviaries with other birds. And the way the aviaries are set up is that there's a central pillar, and then there's aviaries radiating outwards from the central pillar. So we can sit in that central pillar and observe all the different aviaries without actually interacting with them. So it's a very clever way of doing it, really, but it's been really successful, because it's one of the biggest challenges. And at the end of the day, conservation is trial and error. And in the beginning, when the whole idea of reintroductions and raising chicks came into play, they just try to raise them and release them, but habituation was a big issue. So everything that we do with in mind minimize all habituation and interaction with the birds, so that when you release them, they must be scared of humans. I mean, realistically, they're going to do better if they don't like humans and they fly away. It's really not great for research or observations of any sort. It's often not fun, but that is the main part. That answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Any more? We've got a few minutes. Yes, 1 minute. Who are the main predators for ground hornbills? Leopards are a big one, mainly in the nests. I mean, we've got reports of them hunting adult birds in the bush. Once they reach adulthood, it's very uncommon for birds. I mean, because they live so long, they generally tend to survive. But predation in the nest, leopard, genets are a big one. Genets, it's ground hornbills will eat genets, but genets will eat ground hornbills as well. So it works both ways. Yeah. We've had reports of crocodiles. I mean, crocodiles take them. Gary, can you think of any other predators? They eat snakes, but I imagine a big, rock python. Yeah, rock python would take an adult. Chicks, probably rock pythons as well. Did I miss anything, Terry? No.
Yeah, not there.
So you just need a drag. Okay, we're getting there. We nearly got our next slide. me to talk about these slides again? What did they eat? The first mat. No, that one. So the question is, what do ground-hornbills eat? Ground-hornbills eat everything that they can overpower. So they'll eat anything from snakes, scorpions, a lot of invertebrates, chameleons. They eat a lot of scrub hairs, snails, genets. They catch it out. So they work as a group, and they'll chase it into a bush and then kind of surround it. Pretty much everything that they can overpower. Tortoises, yeah, very specialized hunters, and they'll take whatever they can. Answer your question: how do we track the birds? And this comes down to our whole monitoring side of things. Ground-hornbills are notoriously difficult to monitor. Tracking devices have been put on the birds before in the past, but it's been very difficult to put tracking devices on without injuring the birds. So the whole project was kind of scrapped years ago, because what happened with ground-hornbills, they got very long beaks, and when you put a harness on, they try and get it off and they get their beaks stuck, and the birds would have fatalities, and obviously that's the last thing a conservation project wants, so it was scrapped. And now, at the moment, what we focus on is citizen science. Citizen science is the main method for us to actually keep track and monitor bird movements and things like that. So we don't just work in South Africa, we work in the whole of Southern Africa. Obviously South Africa is the main focus, but we're expanding. And through citizen science so far, we've got over 27,000 sightings. So it's really a lot of sightings. Of those, the vast majority are actually in South Africa, 23,000. So when we look more closely at South Africa here, you asked about the strongholds for the species in the country. At least you can really see here in Limpopo that they are very strong. They're in a strong position pretty much. But if we go down to KZN, it's a lot more sparse, and if we go to Eastern Cape, there's very little. Look, this is kind of biased towards the quick question. Exactly, yeah. So we're still needing to get there, but yeah.
So go back to real time data.
With
Live data.
live data, yeah, absolutely. I mean, all the sightings we get is always days later. So, and this is the reason why, with this whole reintroduction program that we do, we actually focus on these two areas here. So actually, it's more along the lines of northern KZN and in the other side of Limpopo pretty much. Because these areas are a lot more sparse, and we don't do reintroductions around this area, I get asked often, can we release birds around Hoedspruit? And the answer is no, it's not really viable. There's a very good source population. So the goal is not to release birds, the goal is just to use the source population and facilitate the natural expansion of the birds. So this is, yes?
See, Swaziland is no population. Is that just lack of data, or?
Swaziland, there is, as far as we know, there's a few groups of ground-hornbills, but they're very central. They're very central in the country, as far as we know. I mean, it also is probably a lack of data. But this gap here between this Mpumalanga and KZN population, where Swaziland is, I mean, it can be an issue. It's not really an issue at the moment, but we want to create that continuous thing and not create these isolated genetic populations. So when this is the reintroduction program, this just shows the areas we're trying to focus on. This is in the western side of Limpopo and then the northern parts of KZN, just to kind of fill this, just to try and fill in this Eswatini area, as I mentioned. So if we look a bit closer now, more closer to home, in the actual kind of Hoedspruit area, this is all the sightings we have here, and you can see in Kruger, you can actually see the roads. And this is just citizen science. Where are the citizens? They're on the roads. Kind of thing. So we do have some from rangers, we collect data from rangers and things, but the amount coming in from citizen science is much, much, much higher. This area here is the APNR, and you can see that dense population. The APNR has been the site for long-term research on the species. So for the past 23 years, there's been people putting up artificial nests after artificial nests for the birds, and what's happened is that the population has, I think at this point, it's more than tripled in the last 20 years. So it's done really, really, really well. And that's the reason why we want to actually just get them out. So with this research, obviously, we can't just do research for a university without having any kind of output. So over the past 23 years, there's been a lot of research that's been done on social structures. So this was my whole thesis. I looked at the social structures of the birds. They live in these groups, but how are the different individuals contributing towards group behavior? Specifically, how are subadults contributing to territory defense, and how they're contributing towards reproduction, and how does that compare to real small chicks as well as the dominant birds in the group. And what we found is that the adult birds in the groups are doing the vast majority of the work. The vast majority of the work. The young juveniles that are about 2 years old are contributing next to nothing. In fact, sometimes they take food from the nest. During territorial intrusions, juveniles actually go and hide away because kidnapping occurs in the species, believe it or not. It's true, kidnapping occurs in ground-hornbills and a few other species. They get recruited into another group. Yeah. So we've actually, so there was one sighting, one viewing of it really, and the group, because the juveniles, because it's usually vocalizations that happen, it's territorial advertisement pretty much. When there's in territorial intrusion and conflict, it's usually a high aerial battle, but the chick will just, or the juvenile will just hide away. And I actually witnessed a few individuals from the one group infiltrate, go and herd the chick back into their territory, and it was their chick.
And you didn't tell them back?
No, they didn't let it. Yeah. So very, very, very interesting. So a lot of my research also looked at, because these territorial conflicts are so important, I looked at how the use of vocalizations actually mediate this. And what I found was that ground-hornbills produce chorus vocalizations that are unique to the group. So each group of ground-hornbills produces their own unique vocalization, to the point where Carrie and myself, after listening to them for way too many hours to be a normal person anymore, we can actually distinguish different groups based on their vocalizations. And it's the same thing with the ground-hornbills, is that they can distinguish who is calling which group, who's a neighbor, who is a new individual, etc., etc. So obviously I mentioned the territory use and defense. Habitat use, we know ground-hornbills like the bushveld, but Carrie's research is looking a lot into actually what do they like about the bushveld. They use a lot of shade. If any of you watch, next time you're all in the Kruger and stuff and you're watching ground-hornbills, watch how they move. They'll forage in the sun, and they just move from shade point to shade point to shade point. And it's just kind of figuring out these habitats that they use, as well as, as I mentioned, they nest in big trees. We need these big trees. So a lot of research has gone into that, and they found that it's usually this mixed bushveld that they enjoy the most. Climate effects on nestlings. This is really Carrie's kettle of fish here. As I mentioned, she's looking at the temperature effects. So on the y-axis here, we have the mean maximum temperature, and on the x-axis, we have the years from 1960 to 2020, and you can see this clear increase in mean maximum temperatures from about 1980. So Carrie's looking at this and looking at what effect this has on not only nestling growth inside the nests, but also what effect it's having on the adult birds while they're foraging, and does this have implications for whether or not they're going to breed, and if they do breed, how successful are they, etc., etc. Because in these hotter temperatures, there's the direct effects of temperature. Temperature's coming on you, it's hot, you have to thermoregulate. With birds, they'll pant. Ground-hornbills don't have feathers underneath their wings, so if you see ground-hornbills hot, they usually sit like this, and that's just to get air movement over that skin. So that costs them, just that behavior of actually thermoregulating. But there's indirect effects as well, which is on food. Food becomes more difficult to find. They're going to be less active, so they're actually, the combination is just them having reduced body condition, which can affect their reproduction and their actual success. So this is all Carrie's thing, and I'm sure we'll convince her to do a presentation in the years to come, which will get more into depth on it. The use of nests as a conservation tool. So this was the previous researchers before Carrie and myself. On the x-axis here we can see the breeding seasons pretty much from 2000 to 2016. On the y-axis, this is just for the APNR, the number of chicks fledged. And on the grey line here we have the number of chicks fledged from natural nests, and the black line, the number of chicks fledged from artificial nests. So you can see up to 2016 there were 90 chicks fledging from artificial nests in the APNR alone. This number now is about 130 birds. So really, really, yes. No, this is natural. This is birds doing their own thing. All we've done is we've put the nest up for them, and they've done their thing. So you can see this really, really bolstered population because of these artificial nests, just highlighting actually the use and the importance of artificial nests in their whole conservation thing. And because the Lowveld has a shortage of them, using these artificial nests is a really effective tool to actually help bolster their population. So this is why I wanted to put them up everywhere and get the birds breaking all of your windows. So the other thing that we looked at was the reproductive success. So a paper by Dr. Alan Kemp, I think it was 1988 or something, he found that in Kruger, on average, birds fledge. So when I say fledge, on average, one chick left the nest on average once every 9 years. In APNR, with the artificial nests, it's once every 3 years. So we've essentially tripled the success. And this is just because artificial nests are a lot more concealed. They're not exposed to temperature, they're not exposed to rainfall. There's reports of wild ground-hornbills, wild chicks in the nest drowning during heavy rainfall. A lot of tree cavities, they're just exposed. Heavy rainfall, nest just fills up, chicks drown. So these artificial nests just provide a good place, and it's the reason that the APNR is doing really, really well.
So what are the nests, the artificial nests made out of?
I mentioned so the question is what the nest's made out of. We've got a few different designs. We've got old wooden ones. We've tried plastic ones. The plastic one temperatures just go wild. At the moment we're using, it's called M1 composite. So it's almost like concrete, and then we've got isoboard, which is almost like polystyrene on the inside. So it's really trying to, I mean, it's not perfect, but it's progress towards where we need to be.
The one side
The wooden one.
Is that also like a concrete?
I can't remember which slide. I can maybe go back. Yeah, so I mean most of the old ones were massive wooden stumps. I don't know where on earth they got those wooden stumps from, to be honest, and I don't know how ethically they were sourced, but they've worked like a bomb for ground-hornbills. So we've got old leadwood ones, we've got wood bean ones, but they've really been up for 20 years now and they're still producing chicks. Actually, the one, if I'm thinking about the same nest that you're thinking of, there's a big wooden one. We think it's the most successful group of ground-hornbills in the country, and they've produced a chick every single year for 17 years in a row. It was really, really successful. Yes?
How much do those kinds of nests cost?
Lots of money. The M1 nest at the moment, all costs considered, and this includes transporting things, is about 10,000 rand a nest. Yeah. If anyone's feeling generous, pick me. And then we'll talk about nests. How many flocks in the APNR? We have 30 at the moment. Yeah, they fledge. What? Not a year. This is total. Total. Over 20 years. 90 chicks. But because they're long lived and they don't breed every year, 90 years. So it's not every year. I wish. Research would be great if it was we don't harvest every year because, like I mentioned, that because it's like we can't just harvest them, put them in a group and release them. They need to be raised for a few years. So we usually only take about 4 or 5, and then they go into that conveyor belt kind of thing, get raised, and then release them. We don't have the capacity at this moment to just take all of them that we can. Plus, it's a lot of manpower to get those chicks. I mean, for us to be successful in our harvesting of the chicks, we need to get there before the chick's 3 days old, and that means a lot of actively checking nests, and these nests are often 45 minutes, an hour's drive between each other to try and time it right. So it takes a lot of effort, a lot of manpower. So if we're trying to mitigate with maybe fly the birds to Los, and then we also have to drive it to Los and drive back as lost. But we're getting there. One day when we big. So what the APNR does, and a lot has done, and a lot of Kruger has done, is that it's created this really, really ideal source population for the Lowveld. So this is why we want to try and just get them to move out of these areas, not by reintroducing them, but by promoting dispersal and facilitating dispersal of the birds into these areas. So this is just an example that I put here. We did have tracking devices on the birds long ago, and it's some of the good data that we got from one of the devices. And if we look here, this green triangle here is a nest. And what I'm just trying to highlight is that you can clearly see on one day, this one bird flew straight to the nest, investigated it, flew straight back to the rest of the group. So it was a young male. He was trying to look for a new breeding opportunity. He knew where the nest was, and he just kept on going. He went to go and look and see if there was any opportunity. So it just highlights the importance and the use of these nests in actually promoting the dispersal of the birds. And this is why we're putting up nests in all these areas in the Lowveld. So this is even more zoomed in here. This red dot is Hoogstraat. This is where we are now. And when we look at all the sightings in the area, you can see this is the APNR pretty much here. We've got some other areas. Makalali's also got a group of birds. We've got some stuff in Kurongwe. But when we overlay the nests, it just highlights the importance of the sightings that we get from all of you. If you're not sending us sightings, no matter how redundant it seems, it makes a huge difference. So if we overlay this with the nests, we can see the nest here. I mean, it doesn't look that clear, but when you create a heat map of it, all of a sudden you can see these hot spots of where the birds are hanging out. This has been weighted to month, so when there's a lot of sightings of birds in a specific month, it goes yellow. When there's infrequent sightings, it's blue. But if you look here, pretty much in all these yellow spots, there's a nesting site. And yes, it is because there's some bias in the monitoring of these birds, but generally these hot spots occur where we can actually see and helps to identify nests. Yes?
Once, one morning, I was going for a walk back and I saw in the distance around when I couldn't identify what was there being Middleton,
That is massively useful. Massively useful. Yes?
So you talk about hornbills have territory, and obviously I'm talking about now that the main sighting that you do have is from nesting. Do you have a proper research about the territorial of a hornbill, or are you just pulling about the data? Because obviously the nest is easier to have data from,
Yeah.
because you know they're going to come back. And so can you, like, how do you actually
Determine where how big their territory is.
territory of the ground-hornbill?
So the territory size was with the tracking units that we had on, but also because we've been ringing the birds for the past 23 years, we can actually determine, and then just from sightings and people sending their sightings saying, I saw this ring bird in this area, we can start piecing it together. And it's taken a long time.
Do you know, like, what's an average actually
for a ground-hornbill?
Yeah.
It depends on the habitat. In this area around Hoedspruit, it's about 80 square kilometers. If you go more north in Limpopo, on the Limpopo River Valley there, then you're looking at about 200 square kilometers. But then you just go a little bit more north to Matobo's in Zimbabwe, and it's 16 square kilometers. So it really depends on the habitat in which they live, and availability of nest sites and food. So I mentioned that these sightings really help us to actually identify, where these birds are hanging out, and I've got a few examples here. So this is on Olifants North here, and there's two triangles in this block here. There's one here in the blue area. That's an artificial nest that we put up when we've kind of started working there. We're thinking, okay, we really want these birds to breed. We want them to expand out of this area towards the west there and get them to repopulate the area. Luckily, everyone on Olifants North was great when we started working out there, and they started sending us sightings, and what happened is that this hotspot appeared. And then someone was like, no, these birds are at our house almost every day. We went to go investigate, and true as nails, there was a natural nest. Beautiful in a fig. So these sightings, I can't understate how important these sightings are. I can't overstate. Anyway, confusing myself. So yeah, so it helps us to really identify nests. And when we look at other areas, this is now in Middleton. You can clearly see a hotspot that's for Middleton or the Conservancy, or whether I get confused. But this hotspot really appears from the sightings that we've gotten. And then when we get sightings, sometimes they come with a picture, and we get pictures like this. And this is a juvenile bird. You can see really short beak, blue eyes. You can see this pale throat now. They got brown feathers. This was sent to us this year, and this is a clear indication that there is a natural nest that these birds are currently utilising. So Carrie and I are actually going on Thursday this week to see if we can find the nest. It's not easy to find a natural nest, but we're going to go and see, and hopefully we can get them to provide them the means so that they're not disturbed and they can continue to breed.
Is there any technology available for putting inside nests that have already been established to monitor the
Putting what, sorry?
Is there technology available to monitor inside the nest?
Inside the nest. So we're looking at it. It's expensive. Cost-wise. I spoke to someone the other day, and they mentioned, because it's quite dark inside the nest, they mentioned probably the best means to actually film inside of there is just the GoPro, the latest GoPro. But the difficult thing comes in is that the ground-horn will break everything. You think, yes, we've got a solution, and then they come and break it.
What about tagging? When they're still young, and when you do send them into the logical facility, when they do get breeding, do they not have some form of technology that is available to insert into the breeding that monitor them for their lifespan?
We're looking at new tracking devices and things, but it's really difficult. We don't want the birds to get injured, and the costs go up significantly with these kinds of things. I'm not an expert. John and Lily will talk much more about this stuff than me. We're working with them to see if we can come up with a solution. But it is just kind of balancing this cost versus the output kind of thing. Because if we can put 200,000 rand tracking device on one bird, it's not going to help us. Because we need data to say this is working. Otherwise, it's just completely anecdotal, and we're just shooting in the dark, pretty much. So the other thing that these sightings do is that because I work in the Lowveld and I live in Hoedspruit, I know generally where birds occur and where they don't occur. People send us sightings. GDI team send us their historic sightings recently, and we could get an idea. They don't have a group of ground-hornbills on the reserve at the moment, but they have dispersing birds that move through sometimes. So what we've done here is that we can actually see, okay, well, where are these dispersing birds going when they go onto the reserve? So from this, we can then look at where should we put a nest. We've asked, and I had a look around, there were no nests. And last week we went and we put up a nest pretty much in one of these hotspots on this reserve, so that when another dispersing bird comes, hopefully it sticks around and lives there indefinitely. Hopefully. And then so the plan is this is an area it's kind of a no man's zone. This is Puzamoya. We've got a Puzamoya nest there. Laura saw the birds last year. That was one of the first sightings I've had in a really long time. So we put a nest up there, and we want to try and fill all these gaps just from this real dense population. Well, I say dense, but it's not dense relatively speaking. But we want to get them to move out and repopulate these areas. Bushspread is filled with private farms and farms that are constantly changing and things. And we just want to help repopulate them because everyone, the people I've spoken to want ground-hornbills there, and we want to get them there. It's just a slow process with ground-hornbills. So what can you do? First things first, sightings. We've got a WhatsApp group. I know everyone hates WhatsApp groups. I'm on 80 plus WhatsApp groups just for ground-hornbill sightings. But they're really, really, really effective because you can be in an area with no signal, send a pin, and when you get signal, the pin still comes up in the right location. Just number of birds, where you saw them, you can send me a pin. Number of birds, if you sex them, great. Saying what they were doing, photos are extremely helpful. Anything. Even historic stuff. If you've got old pictures on your laptops where you know where you saw them, most new cameras have geolocation and stuff like that. Send them through, please. It makes a huge, huge, huge difference. Nests where needed. So I'm not sure where everyone's from here, but if you're in an area and there's no nest, but you think birds and you want birds there, chat to me. We'll see if we can maybe get a nest up, and maybe hopefully get the birds back onto wherever you stay. Reduced lead use is probably not a huge issue in this room. If you are hunting, just dispose of anything properly. Again, I'm going to leave that to John and Lindy to do a talk one day. Very exciting talk of the effects of lead on people. But there have been studies that, I forgot you told me this the other day, but there was a study done in the Amazon that they found that people who hunted more with lead actually had reduced IQ, and there were a lot of lead effects in humans. I'm not saying that's the case here. I'm not saying that. But it is just, and I'm not saying I'm against hunting in any way. It's just there are alternatives, and we want to work together to try and figure out the solution of lead. Because it's not an easy solution. We're not going and saying, don't hunt, because hunting is really, really a good tool. So yeah, just think smart, be smart. And the other thing is, if you want ground-hornbills back in your area, wherever you are, just prepare for window breakages. There are ways to mitigate it. Safety blinds, you can put them on the outside of your windows when you go away. That's a good thing. If you're at the house often, or at the lodge often, it's usually not a big issue because there's a lot of people moving around. The bird generally won't go into the area. Contravision's really good, so you can, this stuff here just stops reflections pretty much. And then there's also SATIB. So if any of you are insured with SATIB don't cover the costs, but they remove any excess of any claims where windows have been broken by ground-hornbills. So it's a small step towards. We've approached other big organisations, but they weren't too keen when we went to them with numbers and things. So understandably. So yeah, just prepare. And there are definitely ways to stop these things from happening. And then, if any of you work with communities, and especially in areas surrounding Bushspread or Kruger or anything like that, please get in touch with us. We have lots of education materials. We've got cartoons, we've got magazines, we've got all sorts of things. We would love to just be involved and to spread the word about ground-hornbills and then get everyone on board. Become custodians for the species and help to conserve them. It's definitely in this Lowveld area. It's definitely a problem that can be solved. It's just going to take years and years and years to do. But we are seeing progress. We are seeing expansion, and we really want to take it further and make a success of this whole thing. So thank you. I know it's not pangolins, but it's even cooler. So yeah, please come chat to me. I'm happy to chat more about it if you have any questions or anything. And also, on the note of pangolins, Saturday, 1st of July, Farmers Market, cupcakes for pangolins. Yay! Please. The supports all the pangolins that come through Witsbrecht and Provet and all those places. Please support them. It goes a long, long, long way. From someone who works for an NGO, it goes a long, 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 long way. Any contribution, please, guys. Thank you. One last announcement on Thursday's slide, please. Sorry to be a downer, but it's such an exciting talk. But please just give the staff 10 minutes to rearrange the tables and things before you bombard them with all your alcohol orders. But yeah, please just give them a moment to put tables out and things, and then once the tables are set, then you can have a seat and